Hey, Todd Hampson here, and today we're talking about the Olivet Discourse. It took place on Tuesday of Passion Week. If you're on my newsletter list, you probably got an invitation to download a sheet that has each day kind of mapped out of the Passion Week from Palm Sunday to Resurrection Sunday. And it has key verses, prophecies in the Old Testament and other places in the New Testament that tie in and came to pass during Passion Week. So anyway, really cool thing. But when you go through the week, Jesus's last week of ministry, so to speak, before the death, burial, and resurrection, Tuesday of that week was the Olivet Discourse. It's the second longest recorded teaching of Jesus in the New Testament, second only to the Sermon on the Mount. And it's found in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. And also in the Matthew account, the following chapter, verse 25, it gives a bunch of parables and then unpacks also the sheep and goats judgment, which I have a video on that. Go check it out. But anyway, we're talking about the Olivet Discourse, and it's basically Jesus's end time speech. It was his information about the apocalypse, so to speak. It's neat when you look in the Old Testament, Jeremiah and Isaiah. I mean, all the Old Testament prophets talked about the future day of the Lord, the tribulation period. But Jeremiah and Isaiah both what have been called Jeremiah's mini apocalypse and Isaiah's mini apocalypse. It really lines up with what we read about in the book of Revelation, a time when God's judging the nations and calling his people back to himself. But what's interesting, I'm going to back up a little bit before Matthew 24. I'm going to unpack what happened there, but there's a little bit of lead up info that I think is really pertinent to have. He said in Luke 19:42, after Palm Sunday, when Jesus was hailed as king, which by the way was fulfillment of prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, from the time of the command to rebuild the temple to the coming of the Messiah would be 483 years. Jesus fulfilled that to the T, came in on Palm Sunday, hailed as king. Of course, several days later, the same people were saying crucify him. But at that moment, he immediately after being hailed as king by the crowds, the Pharisees and the leaders of Israel rejected Jesus. And then he says in Luke 19:42, and he said, if you had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. And we read in Romans that Paul said from that point forward, the Jewish people there had a hardness in part. That they couldn't see that he was the Messiah. It was kind of their time to accept him or reject him. Now, in the future tribulation period, all of God's attention turns back on the Jewish people to win them to himself. But that's another topic for another day. But in the Olivet Discourse, that's kind of the backdrop. And then if you go to Matthew 24, actually go to Matthew 23, and you can read a little bit more about that, how he's talking to the crowds and the disciples, and then kind of, if you look through the Gospels, through Jesus's ministry, he kind of entertained the religious leaders' questions, and they kept trying to trap him over and over again. And he would just answer their questions and kind of send them reeling just with an answer that shuts them up, so to speak, and proves his point. He used that for teaching. And there were times they tried to kill him and he escaped, but overall, he kind of entertained their questions. But then you get to Matthew 23, and there's 7 woes. He did not hold back. Once he was rejected from the leadership there, and he knew that it was time to pivot and go to the cross and focus on redemptive things, he almost intentionally offended the Pharisees. There's 7 woes. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. And he keeps calling them hypocrites over and over again, and calls them blind guides and all kinds of stuff. And you can read that in Matthew 23, but he really laid into them and really pushed them over the edge and let them have it. And then he ends that chapter by saying, again, the people hailed him as king. Everyone now rejected him, and it's time, this gap period where the church fits in. So he knows judgment is coming to Jerusalem, and he talks about that in Matthew 24. But even before then, in verse 37 of 23, he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets and stone those who sent you. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So Jesus is now saying, I'm paraphrasing here, but I'm tying in some verses from Zechariah and other verses that we know in the end of the tribulation period in the book of Revelation. He's basically saying, okay, that's it. You're now going to sadly face judgment. Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, and everything prophesied in the Old Testament about the Jewish people being scattered all over the world is going to happen. And you will not see me again. This was your chance. You'll not see me again until you call on me, until you realize I'm your Messiah. There's a verse in Zechariah that talks at length about that they'll mourn they'll weep for the one whom they pierced. They'll mourn for him, and basically they'll call for him to come back. And that's what brings in Christ at the end of the tribulation period, when a remnant of Jewish believers are protected and they call on him corporately as their Messiah. So that's what he's talking about here. Again, I'll read that verse 39. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They kind of just said that in Palm Sunday, but they were looking for a political leader and didn't mean it. It wasn't a spiritual salvation that they were looking for. They were just looking to get out from under the oppression of Rome. But he's saying there's a time coming where you won't see me again now. You're going to be blinded in part, as Paul says in Romans 11, until you realize I'm your Messiah, and you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So that's the backdrop for Matthew 24. A lot of people just jump straight into Matthew 24, but context is key, knowing where we are in the timeline, what the purposes are. So this is his end time talk to his disciples. They kind of still, even though he said that and they're hearing these things, they really didn't get the fact that he was about to go, even though he told them. They didn't get the fact that he was going to go die and be resurrected and ascend to heaven, and that there was going to be this whole thing called the church age. And the opening of Matthew 24, it says, Jesus left the temple and was walking away. So what's on Jesus's mind is all of this is about to be destroyed. He knew 70 AD was coming, and he'll actually highlight that destruction here in this chapter. But that's what's on his mind. But the disciples, they didn't quite get it. They said, they came up to him, calling his attention to the beauty of the buildings. Do you see all these things? He asked. Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. If you go to Jerusalem today, you see physical, verifiable evidence of fulfilled prophecy, because there's giant stones that were scraped off the Temple Mount when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. And those stones are so heavy that they just left them there, and they're still all around the Temple Mount. So you can go there and see Jesus' prophecy fulfilled, visual evidence of fulfilled prophecy. Then he went up to the Mount of Olives. Now, keep in mind, the Mount of Olives plays a key role for all end time things. He's giving his end time talk here. If you read carefully in Acts 1 and 2, it's where Jesus ascended from. And in Zechariah, it says, or Malachi, it says, that's where he's going to, his feet are going to touch down at the end of the tribulation period. When he returns, he's going to come back to the Mount of Olives. So this key location has a lot to do with end time events and the finality of everything. So that's what Jesus is talking about here. So they said, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So they want to know, hey, when's all this going to take place? They don't realize he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and then much later is the tribulation period. They assume it's all just talking about kind of one time frame. Tell us, they said, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming? Now, real quick note, Jesus didn't say, hey, don't worry about that. You're not supposed to even think about that. Just leave that up to me. He didn't chide them for wanting to know. It's in our heart as believers to want to know how this all ends and how it all wraps up and what the signs are for the Lord's return and all that kind of stuff. But Jesus starts right off the bat. Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. So he's talking about things that are going to continue. But what's wild is also, if you look at these carefully, he's unpacking the first set of seal judgments. If you read this carefully, it lines up with the first set of seal judgments. In Revelation 6, seal judgment number 1 is the white horse comes on the scene, the deceiving false Christ. So that's the first thing he says here. Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah. Then verse 6 in Matthew 24, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. The second seal judgment in Revelation chapter 6 is war, the red horse of war. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation. All these are the beginning of birth pains. So just to be real, there are two views of Matthew within the pre-trib literal interpretation, solid Bible believing camp. Some see Jesus as talking about events that will lead up to the tribulation period in the church age, and that he does have the rapture in view in the context of this. And there's another camp, and this is where I fall. I believe, even though I've wrestled with both sides and looked at them both really carefully, I believe he's talking about the beginning of birth pains, the first judgments in the tribulation period. And I'll unpack why as we move through this. But number one, he's talking to his Jewish disciples who didn't know about a church age, who didn't know about a rapture or anything like that. He's talking specifically about the events of the very commonly known day of the Lord that they're familiar with. Then he talks about, all these are the beginning of birth pains. Then you'll be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. You'll be hated by all nations because of me. That's in the tribulation period. You find there's a great multitude of those who've been martyred early on in the tribulation period. And of course, at the mark of the beast at the midpoint, the whole earth literally turns on anyone who doesn't take the mark. But I think he's talking more about just the natural persecution that's going to be taking place there in the first half of the tribulation period. And here's why I think he says those are the beginning of the birth pains. Then in verse 15, he highlights a mid-tribulation event, a key mid-tribulation event that Daniel spoke of and that we find in Revelation as well. He says, when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, that's the midpoint of the 7-year tribulation, Daniel 9:27, when the Antichrist breaks his covenant and turns on the Jewish people, defiles the temple, and goes after them. So that is clearly talking about what Daniel, and even says, spoken of through the prophet Daniel. So that's your time marker. That is the midpoint of the tribulation. So it makes sense that the preceding verses would unpack some of the judgments before the tribulation period. And that's exactly what we see. And then he talks about when that happens, let no one on the housetop go down to take anything from the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress. So again, this is the second half of the tribulation now, when he's trying to annihilate the Jewish people. And when we find in the Old Testament prophets that they're protected in a place called Basra, which is where modern day southern Jordan is, possibly in Petra, the walled city, the hidden city that you see if you've ever seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. You've seen some pictures of that. But there's this carved out massive city that could protect and house people. And it seems that's the area that there'll be a remnant. 1/3 of the Jewish people, we're told in the Old Testament prophets, will survive the tribulation period, and they're protected. Revelation 12 talks about the fact that they'll be protected from the devil who's going after them through the Antichrist, and his flood of armies, his flood of soldiers are trying to get rid of them. So anyway, that's this moment. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, or there he is, don't believe it. So in other words, while they're hidden in Basra, there's going to be false reports. Oh, Jesus is out in the wilderness. He's out in the desert. So come on out of that hiding place. And it's really just a lure to try to destroy them. So again, that lines up with the second half of the trib. Again, this is after the abomination of desolation. And then immediately after the distress of those days, the second half of the tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Well, that's exactly what we find in Revelation. At the end of the tribulation period, the 1/3 of the stars are darkened, and then there's a great blackness, a great darkness all over the world, just before the sign of the Son of Man comes and Jesus breaks through on his return. Imagine it's like God turned off the light switch on earth, so to speak. It's pitch black. The earth is decimated from all these judgments, and then Jesus breaks through the veil, so to speak, from heaven, and this heavenly glory, the sign of the Son of Man, bursts in with this beautiful light, and the return of the Lord takes place. And that's what it says here in verse 30. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call. Now, this is where some people assert, oh, that must be the rapture because there's a trumpet mentioned and there's angels and that kind of thing. But look at the context and look at the words carefully. And they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. So he brings them all to one place. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, all these judgments, all the judgments of the tribulation, you know that the Lord's return is near. You know it is near, right at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation, the generation that sees all these signs, the generation that sees the first sign is going to see all of them, because the tribulation period is a 7-year period. And this is an important thing because there are some people who teach we're in the third or the fourth trumpet judgment now, or seal judgment now, and the first seal judgment was opened in the early 1900s. All these really goofy things that don't line up with scripture, that it's going to be a long drawn out thing. Jesus here is saying, no, it's going to be a short condensed period of time, the 70th week of Daniel 9. The generation that sees the beginning is going to see the return of Christ. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So anyway, then you can go down through the rest of Matthew 24 and into Matthew 25, and it unpacks it further. But I just wanted to do a quick drive through that teaching of Jesus's, highlight the fact that there's two views. Some views say that the rapture is in view there, and events leading up to the tribulation period. But then, of course, they acknowledge that there's this mid-trib abomination of desolation. But the more I read it, the more I study it, the more I look at the details, it just lines up much better with the fact that Jesus is talking to his Jewish disciples. The mystery of the rapture has not been fully unpacked yet by Paul. That's after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, and Paul's ministry starts. And it was a mystery. There are a few mysteries in the New Testament. Mystery not meaning something that's unknowable, but something that God did not reveal until it was revealed as a mystery. So anyway, that's what happened on Tuesday of Passion Week. I hope you enjoy it. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and I will talk to you again soon. Can't wait to just celebrate the Lord's resurrection this week and think about all the things that we have to look forward to because of what he accomplished on the cross and through his death, burial, and resurrection. God bless. Have a great resurrection day, and I'll talk to you next week.